His clothes belonged to the 19th century, but the accident happened in the 20th. Was it mere coincidence or a mistake of time itself? What unfolded on the bustling streets of New York in the summer of 1950 has haunted researchers, journalists, and storytellers for decades, because the man known as Rudolph Fentz seemed to have stepped out of another century entirely. He appeared suddenly in Times Square, as if he had been dropped there by invisible hands, a figure dressed in clothes that belonged not to the world of neon lights and automobiles, but to an age of horse-drawn carriages and cobblestone streets. Witnesses would later recall that he looked bewildered, his eyes darting rapidly across the landscape of towering buildings, glowing advertisements, and speeding cars. Before anyone could make sense of what was happening, the man stepped into the road, confused and terrified, and was struck by an oncoming vehicle. His death was instantaneous, but his story was only beginning. When officials searched his body, they discovered strange items that raised more questions than they answered. Coins that had not been minted for decades, a copper token from a saloon long demolished, a letter addressed to him in handwriting typical of the 19th century, and a business card that listed an address no longer in existence. Even his pocket watch was of an antique design, unworn yet pristine, as though it had been carried from the past without the burden of time. Investigators quickly identified the man as Rudolph Fentz, but what startled them most was that when they searched the archives, they found records of a man with the same name who had vanished mysteriously in the year 1876. That Rudolph Fentz had left his home one evening for a walk and never returned, and despite exhaustive searches, his family never discovered his fate. Could it be that the man who appeared on the streets of 1950 was the same individual who disappeared 74 years earlier? To the police and to anyone who studied the evidence, the case defied explanation, standing as if time itself had folded in on a single soul. The story spread quickly, first as whispers in police circles, then as sensational headlines in newspapers, and finally as a legend whispered in late-night conversations, where the boundaries between truth and myth blur. Some dismissed the tale as urban folklore, a curious blend of coincidence and exaggeration, while others swore that the physical evidence, those objects from another time, proved beyond doubt that Fentz was a traveler displaced in history. Scholars and skeptics attempted to debunk the mystery, pointing to inconsistencies and the possibility of fabrication. Yet the account refused to die. It lived on in countless retellings, feeding a public fascination with the notion that the past and present are not firmly divided, that somewhere in the fabric of reality there might be cracks wide enough for a man to stumble through. In every retelling, the haunting image of Rudolph Fentz lingers, a man dressed in 19th century garb, standing bewildered amid the chaos of modern New York, only to meet his fate under the wheels of progress. If his story was a hoax, it was one of the most persistent and compelling of the 20th century, a legend that blurred the line between history and science fiction. If it was true, then the implications were far darker, suggesting that time is not a straight line but a labyrinth, and that any of us might, without warning, slip from one century to another. To imagine Fentz's last moments is to picture the terror of a man who believed he was strolling through the lamplit streets of 1876, only to find himself thrust into a cacophony of honking horns, blinding billboards, and machinery that roared like monsters of iron and smoke. His confusion was not just that of a lost pedestrian, but of a man untethered from his own era, betrayed by the very reality he trusted. What cruel trick of fate or flaw in the universe could have uprooted him from one time and hurled him into another? Was it an accident of nature, a rip in the unseen dimensions of time, or perhaps the consequence of an experiment long forgotten? The tale of Rudolph Fentz forces us to wrestle with those possibilities, and though decades have passed since his supposed appearance, the mystery endures, reminding us that the borders of our world may not be as stable as we believe. The death of Rudolph Fentz might have ended in nothing more than a forgotten entry in police records, yet the bizarre artifacts found on his person compelled investigators to look deeper, and with every detail the mystery only thickened. The leather shoes he wore were spotless, their soles unscuffed, as though they had never touched the filth of New York streets. And yet the style was identical to those manufactured in the late 1800s. His coat, with its high collar and fine stitching, bore the mark of a tailor long out of business, a shop that had closed its doors half a century earlier. Even the paper on which his letter was written baffled experts, for its texture and aging matched perfectly with 19th century stationery, and the ink was of a type no longer produced. There was no mistaking that this man carried with him the remnants of another century, preserved as if the years in between had never passed. When his body was identified, officials tracked down records from census archives, immigration logs, and genealogical reports, and every source pointed to a shocking truth. A man named Rudolph Fentz had indeed lived in New York in the 1870s, working as a clerk before vanishing without explanation one evening. Newspaper clippings from that time confirmed that his disappearance had been a small sensation, though soon overshadowed by the flood of urban mysteries in a growing city. His wife had searched desperately, and his son grew to adulthood believing his father had either been murdered or had abandoned the family, though neither theory satisfied the haunting gaps in their lives. Now, nearly three-quarters of a century later, it seemed that this same man had reappeared only to die tragically, his life and death separated not by distance, but by time itself. For the detectives handling the case, the story was too incredible to be true, and yet the material evidence could not be dismissed. They locked away his belongings, studied them under magnification, and consulted historians who confirmed their authenticity. Nothing appeared forged, nothing suggested trickery. The few witnesses who had seen the man moments before his death described him consistently. Confused, staring at the world as if it were some nightmare made real, muttering under his breath in German-accented English, and shielding his eyes from the neon glow that bathed Times Square. Some said he had asked a passerby for directions, though the words seemed quaint, belonging to another era, as if he expected to find a carriage instead of a subway, or a lamplighter instead of electric bulbs. What disturbed the public most was the thought that this man had not traveled willingly. He had not sought an adventure into the future, nor did he appear to understand where, or when, he was. He looked instead like a victim of some cosmic accident, hurled forward against his will, robbed of the context that had once given his life meaning. If time travel was real, the Rudolph Fentz case suggested it was not controlled by scientists or hidden inventors, but was chaotic, random, and cruel. This possibility fascinated writers and paranormal enthusiasts, who quickly spread the story beyond New York, weaving it into magazines and radio broadcasts until it became one of the era's most enduring mysteries. For skeptics, however, the case demanded rational answers. They argued that the objects could have been inherited antiques, that the man could have been eccentric or delusional, that the entire tale was exaggerated by reporters hungry for sensation. Yet no clear explanation silenced the whispers. Every attempt to rationalize the details left something unresolved, a stubborn remainder that made the story feel less like a hoax and more like a glimpse of a terrifying truth, that time is porous, that history can leak into the present. And as the legend of Rudolph Fentz grew, so too did the questions it raised. If one man could slip through centuries, how many others might have vanished into the void of time, unrecorded, unrecognized, and forgotten by history itself? In the weeks that followed, rumors spread across New York that the city had witnessed a true traveler from another age, and while officials attempted to keep the matter quiet, the allure of such a mystery was impossible to contain, for humanity has always been both terrified and enthralled by the notion of bending time. The police files recorded the case in plain language, but the officers themselves admitted in private conversations that they had never encountered anything so inexplicable, and some even confessed to being unable to sleep, haunted by the image of the bewildered man who had looked so out of place beneath the glowing advertisements of Times Square. Those who examined his belongings more closely noted further oddities. The coins in his pocket were not only outdated but unworn, as if freshly minted, immune to the corrosion of decades. The saloon token he carried bore the insignia of a bar that had been demolished long before 1950, and yet its edges were sharp, its etching crisp, as though it had traveled across time untouched. Historians cross-referenced every detail, and each artifact aligned perfectly with the period from which Rudolph Fentz was said to have vanished. How, then, could such items survive without decay, unless they themselves had been transported directly from that forgotten year of 1876? Newspapers capitalized on the fascination, printing speculative accounts that transformed the incident into a modern ghost story, though unlike phantoms or legends of the supernatural, this was a tale supported by physical evidence. For readers, the idea that a man could suddenly appear decades after his disappearance suggested that the boundaries between past and present were less secure then. They imagined that perhaps time was not a river flowing in one direction, but an ocean with hidden currents, capable of carrying individuals to unimaginable shores. Philosophers and scientists alike began debating the possibility in journals and cafes, some arguing that time travel was mathematically conceivable under the theories of relativity, while others dismissed the entire matter as psychological trickery, a hoax engineered for fame. Yet those who had spoken with the witnesses, or held in their hands the letter and pocket watch taken from Fentz, found it difficult to dismiss the weight of reality pressing against the story. If it was fiction, it was a fiction that refused to fade, persisting with the stubbornness of truth. Meanwhile, among the public, the legend of Rudolph Fentz began to merge with other tales of temporal anomalies. The stories of pilots who vanished only to return years later without aging. The myths of soldiers who disappeared on battlefields only to be seen wandering decades later in uniforms long obsolete. The accounts of villages swallowed by fog and reappearing centuries out of place. Together, these tales formed a tapestry of suspicion that perhaps time was riddled with fractures, and that Fentz had stumbled through one of these unseen cracks, emerging disoriented into a future he could not comprehend. His tragic death, then, seemed doubly cruel. Not only had he lost his place in history, but in the very moment he might have explained his plight, he was struck down, silenced forever by the unforgiving wheels of progress. Some suggested this was no accident at all, but fate itself, a deliberate sealing of the anomaly, as though the universe corrected its mistake by erasing the man it had displaced. Such speculation gave the story a mythic quality, turning Rudolph Fentz into a symbol of mankind's fragile grasp on the order of time, and raising disturbing questions. If time can claim us, then none of us are truly safe. For any moment we might vanish in a centuries unknown, to live and die in a world utterly alien to our own. As the decades passed, the legend of Rudolph Fentz refused to die, persisting like a ghost in the collective memory of those who cherished mysteries that defy rational explanation, and with every retelling the tale grew more elaborate, drawing in skeptics and believers alike who each sought to either dismantle or preserve the story. By the 1970s, paranormal researchers had adopted Fentz as one of their strongest examples of accidental time travel, placing his case alongside the vanishing villages of folklore and the alleged aircraft lost to the Bermuda Triangle, while magazines and radio programs dramatized his fate to audiences eager for stories that blur the lines between science and superstition. At the same time, academic investigators and journalists attempted to trace the origin of the account, some uncovering evidence that the first detailed version of the story might have appeared not in police records, but in the pages of Science Fiction magazine in 1951, suggesting that the tale of Rudolph Fentz was not history, but literature. This revelation complicated matters. If the story was invented, how had it acquired such a strong reputation as fact, with so many details repeated consistently across sources? Critics argue that people simply wanted to believe that the human mind craves anomalies because they force us to question the rigidity of our world, and thus the story was retold so often that it became embedded in the culture as though it were true. Yet others countered that the presence of earlier references, scattered newspaper clippings, and whispered accounts from police circles suggested the possibility that the magazine merely fictionalized an event that had already occurred, disguising fact as fiction to escape ridicule. In this tension between skepticism and wonder, Rudolph Fentz became more than a man. He became an idea, a mirror reflecting our deepest fascination with time and our inability to master it. The very ambiguity of the tale, the uncertainty of whether he truly lived and died in two separate centuries, was what granted it such longevity, for the mind is never satisfied by mysteries that can be neatly closed. Instead, we are drawn to those enigmas that remain slightly out of reach, eternally unresolved, like shadows flickering on the edge of understanding. To imagine Rudolph Fentz is to imagine ourselves in his place, walking confidently through the familiar streets of our own era, only to step into another century without warning, confronted by alien machines, unfamiliar languages, and customs that render us strangers in a world that should have been ours. Such a thought unsettles even the most rational mind, because it implies that time is not a fortress but a fragile veil, and that at any moment it could tear. This is why, long after the supposed facts of the case were debunked or discredited, the legend endures in documentaries, podcasts, and late-night conversations, where truth matters less than the enduring chill of possibility. Was Rudolph Fentz a victim of time itself, or simply a character born of imagination? In the end, it may not matter, because his story has achieved something greater than factual certainty. It has become a parable, a reminder that no matter how secure we feel in the present, the past and the future are always closer than we think, pressing against us in ways we may never fully understand. Yet even as skeptics sought to bury the tale beneath layers of rational dismissal, Rudolph Fentz refused to stay silent, because the power of his story lay not in the fragile scaffolding of evidence, but in the haunting image it conjured: a man in outdated clothes, bewildered in the heart of a city that should not have belonged to him, cut down before he could explain his presence. Over the years, authors and lecturers resurrected him again and again, citing the Fentz case whenever the possibility of time anomalies was raised, and with each retelling, small embellishments crept in, like ivy climbing an abandoned wall, until the legend itself became as complex and enduring as any folktale passed down through generations. Some accounts emphasized the terror on his face. Others described his speech as fragmented, filled with words and idioms long fallen from modern use. And still others insisted that his final moments were marked by a cry for help that went unheard above the roar of traffic. To the believer, these details were not contradictions but affirmations, for folklore thrives on multiplicity, shaping itself anew in every voice that repeats it. Meanwhile, those who delved into archives uncovered curious overlaps. Reports of other men in strange attire appearing briefly in cities. Witnesses claiming to see soldiers wandering decades after their wars had ended. Entire villages whispered to have reappeared centuries after vanishing. Each fragment added another thread to the tapestry, suggesting that perhaps Rudolph Fentz was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a larger, hidden pattern that eludes our understanding. Scientists in fringe circles began to hypothesize about natural wormholes, dimensional folds, or magnetic disturbances capable of dislodging individuals from their proper place in time, and while mainstream academia scoffed, these theories gained traction among the curious, the dreamers, and the fearful. For them, Fentz was not merely a man, but proof that the world was far stranger than textbooks admitted, proof that the universe contained loopholes that mocked human certainty. And what made the case even more chilling was its tragic finality. Unlike a fictional traveler who might adapt to his new world or find a way home, Rudolph Fentz was given no chance. Thrust into a hostile century and killed before his story could be told in his own words. His silence became the most powerful testimony of all, leaving others to interpret, argue, and imagine what had truly occurred. Thus, his legend lingered, not just in dusty files or yellowed newsprint, but in the cultural imagination, where it lives still, a riddle without an answer, a reminder that beneath the surface of the ordinary, there may be cracks that open into the impossible. In time, the case of Rudolph Fentz began to drift from the pages of newspapers into the fertile soil of popular culture. where fact and fiction intertwine until they're indistinguishable. And it was here that his story achieved immortality. For while files might be closed and evidence locked away, legends do not die. They adapt, they resurface, and they haunt. Writers of speculative fiction borrowed his name as a symbol of the lost traveler. Radio hosts whispered his fate during late-night broadcasts, and paranormal investigators invoked him whenever they spoke of unexplained displacements across history. Even skeptics, in their efforts to debunk the tale, found themselves keeping alive, for every article that claimed to expose the hoax only reignited public curiosity, ensuring that Rudolph Fentz remained on the tongue of anyone drawn to mysteries that resist resolution. What fascinated people most was not simply the idea of a man displaced in time, but the stark ordinariness of Fentz himself. He was not a scientist experimenting with strange machines, nor a visionary seeking to pierce the veil of reality, but an ordinary clerk, a family man, who vanished during a routine evening walk and supposedly reappeared decades later on a street he could never have imagined. This ordinariness was precisely what made his tale so haunting, because if time could consume him, then it could consume anyone, tearing us from our lives without warning and depositing us into a future or a past that would strip us of identity and meaning. Imagine, for a moment, the terror of stepping outside your home for a familiar stroll only to blink and find yourself in a city that feels both familiar and alien. The architecture taller, the machines roaring louder, the language shaped by slang and invention you do not recognize, the faces rushing past with urgency that seems inhuman. For Rudolph Fentz, that terror would have been magnified 100-fold, because he did not even live to tell his tale. Instead, his body lay broken on the asphalt of Times Square, surrounded by strangers who regarded him not as a marvel, but as an accident. Yet within that accident lay a story that continues to echo, because people sense in their bones that reality is more fragile than we like to admit, that the universe is a web with threads that may fray, and when they do, someone may fall through. Whether his case was the record of an actual temporal fracture or a brilliantly told fiction that people mistook for fact, the result is the same. Rudolph Fentz stands as a symbol of our dread that time is not a straight road, but a labyrinth in which we may at any moment lose our way. Over the years, investigators who revisited the legend of Rudolph Fentz often found themselves entangled in a puzzle not of evidence, but a perception, because the more one searched for the truth, the more elusive it became, as though the story itself was a trick of time, reshaping with every generation that dared to question it. Some researchers swore they uncovered legitimate police reports that documented the 1950 incident, claiming to have seen photographs of his belongings, while others insisted those records were later proven to be fabrications, mere extensions of a fictional tale published in 1951 by a writer of speculative short stories. But if it was fiction, why did so many individuals, unconnected to one another, repeat the details as though they had witnessed them firsthand? The paradox was unsettling. Either a work of imagination had seeped so thoroughly into public memory that it became accepted history, or else the official debunking itself was a smokescreen designed to hide an uncomfortable reality, one in which time does not behave according to the laws we think govern it. For the casual listener, this ambiguity only deepened the fascination, because stories that refuse to resolve are the ones that stay with us, gnawing at the edge of reason long after we've heard them. Psychologists studying folklore noted that the Fentz case exemplified the way human beings crave uncertainty, for an unresolved mystery provides endless space for imagination to expand, while a solved one is quickly forgotten. In this sense, whether Rudolph Fentz truly walked from 1876 into 1950 mattered less than the enduring fact that people wanted him to have done so, because his fate touched something primal in the human spirit. The fear of being lost in time, the dread of stepping outside the order of history and finding oneself erased from every anchor of meaning. And perhaps this is why the legend still thrives, decades after the supposed event, retold in documentaries, dramatizations, and online forums where countless voices argue over fragments of the tale, piecing together their own versions as if assembling a puzzle with missing pieces. Each version shifts slightly, but the core remains the same: a man out of time, bewildered, frightened, and destroyed by a future he never sought. His story becomes less about him as an individual and more about us as a species, reflecting our collective unease with the passage of time and the suspicion that the ground beneath us is not as stable as we pretend. It reminds us that while we build calendars, clocks, and equations to measure and control time, we do not truly understand it, and perhaps never will. The mystery of Rudolph Fentz also began to attract the attention of those who saw in his legend not just a curiosity, but a warning. For if a man could be torn from his era and thrown helplessly into another, then time itself was not the steady guardian of human life we believed it to be, but a dangerous and unpredictable force. Philosophers speculated that Fentz's sudden appearance might have been the result of a natural rupture in reality, a tear in the unseen layers of existence that occasionally open and close without pattern, while others suggested that his displacement might have been linked to hidden experiments in the late 19th century, secret attempts at bending time that went catastrophically wrong. Though there was no evidence for such claims, the absence of proof did little to deter imaginations, and the name of Rudolph Fentz soon became shorthand for the terror of being lost in time. His case was cited alongside the vanishing crew of the Mary Celeste, the pilots of Flight 19, and the soldiers who disappeared without trace during wartime, woven into the broader tapestry of mysteries that resist conventional explanation. In all these tales, the common theme was dislocation, the stripping away of certainty, and the unsettling possibility that the universe does not operate according to the neat rules we impose upon it. In the classrooms of skeptics, Fentz was dismissed as a fabrication, a tale too neat and cinematic to be true, but outside academia, in bars, in living rooms, in dimly lit gatherings, the story was retold with solemn conviction, as though speaking of it aloud might invite the same fate upon the listener. And therein lay its power. Unlike distant legends of gods and monsters, the story of Rudolph Fentz felt. Immortality, his identity forever preserved not by census records or gravestones, but by whispers and speculations that ripple outward across decades. He is both nowhere and everywhere, a man who died in an accident long ago, and, at the same time, a living myth that continues to haunt conversations about what it means to exist in a universe we barely understand. The deeper one looks into his story, the more one realizes that the enigma is not confined to Rudolph Fentz alone, but extends to us, to the very fabric of human life, where past, present, and future are not separate compartments, but interwoven strands in a pattern too vast for our limited eyes to see. And yet, as the story travels further into the 21st century, it begins to feel less like an isolated mystery and more like a mirror held up to the human condition. Because what haunts people about Rudolph Fentz is not just the possibility of time travel, but the experience of being utterly lost, of finding oneself surrounded by signs, lights, and languages that belong to a different age, unable to communicate or adapt, caught between eras that cannot reconcile. This sensation, once rare, is now familiar to many in a world where technology reinvents itself every few years, where cultural shifts happen so quickly that entire generations find themselves out of step, as though they too had stumbled from the past into an unrecognizable present. In this sense, Rudolph Fentz becomes more than a legend. He becomes a symbol of modern alienation, a warning that progress does not wait for those who fall behind, and that the future, like the traffic that claimed him, is relentless and indifferent. Writers, filmmakers, and theorists have borrowed his image to illustrate everything from the terror of globalization to the bewilderment of digital transformation, embedding his story into novels, documentaries, and speculative essays, ensuring that he remains not only remembered but reinterpreted. In this way, the myth of Fentz evolves just as societies evolve, reshaped each time by the fears and fascinations of those who tell it, proof that stories, like people, are not static but fluid, traveling through time in their own strange fashion. Perhaps, then, the real traveler was never Rudolph Fentz, but the story itself, slipping across decades, wearing new clothes, speaking new languages, but always carrying the same core mystery. What happens when the human soul collides with the immensity of time, and what does it mean to belong to an era that does not recognize you?